Hello, my name is Eric Holmquist and welcome to ERM Advantage. Here we explore best practices in enterprise risk management, those that lead to real, sustained business value. Now, throughout this video series, we're going to take a look at every aspect of a strong enterprise risk management program, including risk appetite, policies, frameworks, risk assessments, committees, metrics, reporting, automation, and so much more. But for this first video, we're going to explore a slightly provocative topic, and that is it time for a radical reimagining of conventional risk management thinking and approaches? Let's get into it. Now, by way of background, I've been in the financial service industry for over 30 years. In that time, I've seen every form of risk management program and framework, some effective, some interesting, and some well-intentioned but ridiculous. Enterprise risk management as a discipline has been evolving for some time now, and it can be seen in an almost infinite number of varieties across companies and industries. Many contain very familiar elements and methods, whereas some attempt to be clever and novel, but often just aren't very practical or frankly sound. There are a variety of published frameworks available, influenced by a number of sources, including Basel, regulatory guidance, trade associations, and industry consultants and thought leaders. However, in talking with peers and clients, listening to conference speakers, and reading industry blogs and articles, I definitely get the sense that we are regrettably a long way from maturity. I also get the sense that in many ways we've been going in the wrong direction. When I ask colleagues, are the frameworks we're using today sufficient to carry us through the monumental changes about to take place in the financial services industry, the answer is universally no. So let's talk about what isn't working and try to figure out a better set of practices. Now, as I mentioned, my field is financial services, and to some extent this material will skew in that direction. But that's mostly in relation to where I believe we're doing things wrong or could improve. Once we get into actual framework sections later on, all the material will be equally applicable to any company in any industry. Risk management really is industry agnostic, and so while many of the questions may change by industry, the methods really shouldn't. Now, would I use this framework to put a man on the moon or run a nuclear power plant? Probably not. But for any company that's made up of a strategy and process and people, these methods and these tools should be equally applicable. Now, since much of our problem often starts with differences in terminology, before proceeding, I think it's worth providing some basic working definitions for a number of terms, and we'll revisit this concept throughout our series as we go. The first is a contemporary definition from the ISO standard, and the last two were suggested by me. So, risk. Basically, risk is the uncertainty of outcomes while in pursuit of our strategic objectives. Now, what's nice about this is it gets us past the old, quote, things that could go wrong. And it's a much more holistic view that considers that things could go better or worse than we expected. Then, risk management. A little denser here, but basically I would describe this as the systems, methods, and processes designed to identify, measure, control, and monitor risks to ensure that everything from strategy to operations is aligned with stated risk appetite levels, appropriately balancing risk and return. There's a lot there, but really emphasizes the idea that we're not going for just minimizing risk. We're not going for eliminating risk. Instead, we're focusing on alignment against our strategy and our risk appetite. And finally, enterprise risk management. Basically, a structure for consistently managing risks across the entire organization on an integrated basis. Now, there are several elements here that will come out later on as we talk through optimizing programs in the framework, but the point is the whole enterprise in a consistent way on an integrated basis. So conceptually then, the goal of ERM should be about supporting strategy, maximizing efficiency, optimizing operations, and balancing risk and return. But that's not what we have. What we largely have, it seems, are documentation exercises. A lot of lists and pictures and colors and numbers that look great, but really don't tell us very much that we don't already know. Even the majority of GRC software solutions fail to understand the fundamental elements of risk-taking and how to build solutions around optimizing risk and return and supporting strategic decisions. Instead, are focused on simply automating rudimentary blocking and tackling, including an overemphasis on operational risks, risk control registers, etc. Now, organizations of every size want to have a strong risk management framework and program, and many have succeeded. But many find themselves frustrated at the inability to achieve the value desired. The purpose of the series of videos is to try and identify some of the fundamental problems with enterprise risk as it's commonly implemented and explore what I would consider to be the best practices in approaching a strong, practical framework. One that should, if done correctly, create demonstrable business value. Now, some aspects of this material will simply be suggestions around better approaches to familiar practices. But in other cases, I'm challenging long-held orthodoxy that may be considered sacrosanct, but in my opinion, much of what we're doing is in need of a radical reimagining. Now, when it comes to problems with a lot of risk management programs, most tend to involve flawed approaches and misguided assumptions. The results may be conceptually interesting, but don't really support basic decision making and is seen as really nothing more than a compliance exercise by business units. So here are some of the key areas where I believe many current methods and practices fall short. Number one, programs built in the language of risk instead of the language of the business. In our zeal to create impressive frameworks for risk management, we've created a whole lexicon of confusing terms, concepts, methodologies that are completely foreign to the average person. Rather than building risk concepts on top of the business's native language, we ask staff, management, and the board to learn a whole new language, one that is not always intuitive or insightful. Some of this is necessary and does take education and training. But if our language of risk management is too foreign, too complex, it's unlikely to be adopted by the people that need to own it and to whom it can help the most. Number two, programs built around risk types. Now, this may be the most provocative, if not controversial, observation. It's quite possibly the single biggest factor leading to confusion and underperforming programs. It's also the most misguided design approach to effective risk management. Now, there's an irony here that you really have to appreciate. Risk management was developed in part to help break down operational silos where the left rarely knew what the right was doing, in order to help better understand the company and its operations more holistically. And yet, we in the risk profession and all of our wisdom decided to divide our world up into distinct risk categories, only to have created whole new silos that we're now trying to break down. This has been exacerbated by well-intentioned but misguided standards bodies like Basel that encourage frameworks built around these categories. But that has only led to more confusion and conclusions that practitioners see as having little to no value for reasons we'll discuss later. The fundamental problem is that on a day-to-day basis, organizations do not manage by individual risk types, either strategically or operationally. Banks are not in the business of credit, they are in the business of lending. And lending brings with it a variety of risk types, including credit, interest rate, compliance, operational, reputation. To consider one type in isolation will only give one piece of a risk picture and an incomplete one. No risk falls into only one category, so why would I ever build a framework that way? It doesn't and has never made sense to approach risk frameworks this way, and yet this is what so much of our industry does. In addition, not all risk types are the same. They vary significantly relative to the proximity of a potential event. For instance, the key financial risks, credit, market, interest rate, liquidity, are primarily determined by policy and the related governance and program structures. Decisions are made at a given point in time around the degree of risk to be taken, and this is built into the structure for things like policies and procedures. In other words, these are more design risks based on the strength of strategies rather than execution. For operational risks, the seeds may be baked into things like process or technology design, but largely manifest based on people's actions over time, both inside and outside the company. And reputation risk has never made sense as a primary risk type, as it's almost always exclusively a consequence of the bank's strategy or actions. No other industry that I'm aware of anyway starts with risk types first and then thinks about risks. It just doesn't make sense. The fact is that risk categories tell us more about the source and nature or dimensions of a risk, but almost nothing about the risk itself. Now, this will be explored in great detail later on when we look at how risk types can be used effectively, but as a component of an assessment, not a foundational dimension. But the fact is, we are using risk types wrong. Number 3, a lack of standards. Unfortunately, nobody has been able to propose, nor the industry adopt, any acceptable standards for things like risk calculations. This is unfortunate in that it's been left up to individual companies, consultants, trade groups, etc., to develop a variety of different types of methodologies which range from reasonable to the ridiculously absurd. This is something that simply needs to be addressed, and I've actually been in discussions with a large trade group about proposing a possible set of standards that I think would be hugely helpful to the industry. Number 4, unnecessary complexity. Too many risk programs that I've seen have become overly complex or simply overbuilt, capturing at times massive risk registers covering every conceivable risk, regardless of its significance or potential impact to the business. Simply put, if a tool is too complicated, no one will use it. And when it comes to risk governance, there are actually times when less is more. If a business unit sees that minute risks are being captured, it tends to diminish their perception of the value of the overall program. Number 5, risk appetite ambiguity. Now, ask any banker, how do you feel about your risk appetite framework? And the answer will almost always be either what framework, or we have one, but it doesn't really affect anything. This is a serious problem because a clearly defined risk appetite framework, both philosophical statements about risk taking and related metrics and limits, is a central key component to effective risk management. But too often what this means is some abstract statements to satisfy an expectation to provide something, but that's rarely communicated down into the ranks and doesn't significantly influence strategy, decision-making, or risk analysis. Stop any random person in the company and ask them, what is your understanding of an acceptable level of risk for your area? And they'll either look at you blankly or worse, suggest that it's expected that nothing should ever go wrong. Here's a hard truth. The risk appetite statements and framework is one of the most important tools we have in components of the program, but ones that are either underdeveloped or developed but never communicated or operationalized are worthless artifacts. Number 6, consistently poor understanding and use of metrics. After having reviewed dozens and dozens of risk scorecards, it becomes painfully obvious that unfortunately most institutions don't understand the design principles behind effective metrics. Rather, we have scorecards that are loaded with dozens, if not hundreds, of metrics that provide little or no useful information in actually managing the business. Just because something can be measured doesn't mean it's meaningful. This becomes the functional equivalent of a smoke detector with no batteries. It looks great on the wall, but doesn't do a darn thing. Number 7, disconnected programs. Now what this means is frameworks that are not aligned between strategy and risk appetite, or across different risk components, or between risk assessments and risk metrics. Strategies or risk philosophies that are beautifully articulated at an executive level, but then never communicated down in a way that can guide the business. Programs that are disconnected across risk, compliance, internal audit, etc. Risk assessments that are too focused on operational or process risks with little or no attention to the risks that can actually destroy an institution, most of which are strategic, policy, program related, or external risks. And finally, programs and frameworks that are so underdeveloped or so underregarded as to not factor into managers' and executives' incentive compensation. Number 8, lack of general framework maturity. Frameworks which only work for limited purposes, such as rudimentary enterprise or operational assessments, but can't be applied to specific areas such as assessments for products, markets, strategies, etc. Or they don't incorporate sub-assessments such as for compliance, IT, information security, etc. in order to provide a truly accurate enterprise perspective. And finally, mercifully, number 9, a lack of cultural transparency. And this is less about framework as it is about culture. But unfortunately, many institutions still struggle with a willingness to openly and transparently discuss and consider the risks we take and why we take them. Or worse, that punish people for speaking openly about possible excess risks. Which means never seeing true value from our enterprise risk programs or being able to leverage these tools to make better business decisions. And never really knowing with any degree of confidence if we are being adequately compensated for the risks we are taking. Now, there are other more technical challenges, including data quality, skill set gaps, and even more granular framework flaws, much of which will be addressed in subsequent videos. But all of this means it's time for a serious rethinking of how we approach ERM frameworks and processes if we're going to create programs that are efficient, effective, and lead to actual value creation for institutions. Now, if you recognize any of these challenges in your own programs, hopefully the information that follows will help you start thinking about better approaches. I know this was a lot, but don't worry. We're going to cover every area of these challenges as we go along. In the next video, we're going to start talking about solutions that will serve as the foundation for all of our remaining videos. So what do you think? Did I miss anything? Are there ways that you find your own program continues to fail to live up to your expectations? If so, leave a comment below. Also, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button as it really does help out the channel.